Yeah. Action. Sure. So the project is Museum in Drag. This is where the project began. It's not necessarily where it's ending up. We'll kind of go through that in a little bit. The idea was sort of subversive content was one of the underlying ideas behind this. The site was Red Hook, and it was partly chosen for sort of some ideas of outcast that relate to the ideas of drag queen and sort of subcultures. This is the building right here that we chose as the site. It's sort of massive in scale. Scale was one of the issues that we were looking at and wanted the studio to attack. And ideas of massive scale, not just sort of things in scale. And so, sorry, but these are things that were researched for by the studio. And museums, we looked at museums, different museums, looking at trying to get an understanding of volume of museums and how they function. And then, of course, drag queens. We looked at drag queens because I think that there's a lot of sort of architectural ideas that could be that are in that, ideas of complexity, ambiguity, contradiction, surface, and that sort of thing. But that's how it started. And to really kind of go back to the beginning, we need to sort of, well, one of the things that happened was, after the midterm, I began to kind of question my own sort of teaching ability, sort of my own teaching methods, and there was a certain amount of crisis of confidence that occurred. But the question that I was asking myself is sort of the design fundamentals to the title of the course. What does that mean? What's important? So I came to ideas of creativity and the creative process, trying to understand how the creative process works, essentially, and how we can kind of produce an environment where a lot of creativity occurs. Relationships, I figured that I felt like this was an important thing to focus on, the establishment of relationships. It's something that sort of the studio has been focused on. And I, well, whatever. And then sort of in terms of the relationships, creating kind of the use of randomness as a method, either as an artist, which is sort of completely sort of without a structure, versus the scientists who have a more methodological way of going about, but it's still sort of idea of creating random relationships. Fluid dynamics, there's an idea of chaos in here where kind of we don't, sort of far from equilibrium, essentially. And then there was an idea of active versus passive, receiver of information, trying to get the students to sort of be active in the information and reorganize. And as I mentioned that, the Museum of Drag was how it began. It became this idea of shoot the arrow, move the target, follow your interests within the studio, and then relate it back to the studio itself. And then one of the fundamental ideas, for me at least, with this project was this idea of architecture versus building. Architecture is about an idea versus building, which isn't. And so let's, rather than talking about architecture or building, let's talk about the idea. And so the purpose of this is to representation of the idea through pk-lite, and also representation of the idea through architecture. And that's it. Okay, so we start.